Now, a lot of people are lazy, right? Chapter 1, what's the title? 1. Chapter 2, what's the title? 2. Chapter 30, what's the title? 30. Or people try to get cute, right? They've watched Friends or something. The one with the X. You can do that. But we recommend at least thinking. Just wanted to motivate ourselves by talking a little bit about our goal as authors. There's only one. Sell books. Now, I'm not going to diss people who write for themselves. I'm not going to, pull a semi-Emily Dickinson and hide everything until you die. So that's somewhat apocryphal. But we're focused on selling books. And that means one thing. Sorry, I'm going to skip this part. Money, fame, applause, whatever, happiness. It means focusing on your product. Our goal is to produce a book that is going to make readers happy. We want them to say, wow, when they finish the book. That was a great story. Better to have one person love your story than 10 people like it, because that's how you build a following. That's how you build repeat customers. And then secondly, they'll tell other people, and if that all goes well, you keep producing books, you get the big bucks. As I said, I watched Brandon Sanderson yesterday and I was inspired. May us all achieve the same level of greatness. So I already mentioned this, but I want to go over it one more time. Writing a novel's hard. And the main reason it's hard is because your brain has limited capacity to think about things. You can remember a lot of things, but actively thinking about things requires your full attention and focus. So, for example, if you're focused on writing a sentence, that is going to occupy your entire brain space. If you start thinking about story development, the sentence level gets shoved aside and you start thinking about the entire story. And then there's any intermediate level. Today we're going to be talking about chapters. So you can conceive of a chapter all at once, hold that in your head, but you have to deal with around 30 chapters. So your brain is constantly switching back and forth between these levels if you're doing it properly. Now I say properly because some authors do it improperly, or at least they don't really think about these other levels. They focus on just writing a good sentence, writing the next sentence, writing a next sentence. When they get to 3,000 words or so, plunk, they break it into a new chapter, and then they start again. And so their entire 100,000 words is just a stream of sentences. Guess what else does that? Spoiler alert, that's exactly what AIs do. It's even more low level because they just focus on coming up with a word or phrase, and then they attach another word or phrase to it. So every AI, not every, but every LLM output is just that, trying to predict what the next sentence is, what the optimal next sentence to give back in response to a prompt is. And that is not what we're doing. We are sharing artistic vision with our readers that is going to have some kind of overlapping meaning. And to do that, you need to move past the sentence level, past the chapter level, up to the overall picture level. And at the same time, you have to make sure that all these levels are working together. And you can struggle through that, and many people do. And it's a learned skill. And where we come in is we try to offer tools that are going to help you master the switches between those levels so that your final product will be better at every level. So we just wrapped up our contest, our best contest yet. If you've entered the contest, some of you may have gotten invitations to our mandatory publication candidates meetings. I don't know if they've all been mailed out. I don't have anything to do with judging, so you can don't have to kiss ass because that's not going to help. But I like it anyway, so don't be afraid to. But this workshop was designed as a next step after the contest. So the presumption is you're working on a novel, you have your first chapter in hand, then hopefully you did the minimal complete story exercise, which we recommended in our emails, our blogs, and the feedback we give. That exercise will help you get your entire story into your head. And if you haven't done that yet, I strongly urge you to do so. And then the next piece you need to start working on is what we call the value triangle. Now, show of hands, how many of you have heard of this exercise? Kyle Ann, have you heard of this? All right, so we didn't do a workshop on value triangle this time. It's a simple concept. The main purpose of our workshops is for you to practice these tools on your own work. So I'm just going to show this to you because it is foundational to doing the spreadsheet we're going to be working on today. So the way to think about a value triangle, so this is a picture. It's just a triangle. It's got three sides. One of them is genre, largely plot, right? That's the base. And then the hypotenuse, if you remember middle school geometry, no, not geometry. I think it was geometry. The hypotenuse is the character, right? As we talked about just a few seconds ago. Internality is the hallmark feature of a novel. So getting your character right and establishing empathy with your reader is hugely important. That's where we do all the heavy lifting there. And so that's the longest side of the value triangle. Genre's equally important, right? Most people, 90% of readers read within a single genre, therefore their next purchase decision is a function of that genre. You have to get that right. And largely genre is, everything works together to put your book into a particular genre. But for today, we're going to focus on plot. That's the one you have the most control over. And then finally, there's bonus. So bonus is a little bit of it's a more nebulous category. Bonus is something that you as an author uniquely give to your novel. So the examples I give are humor, having a twist, delving into a world, or what we call doubling down. So if you take Last Kingdom, part of the value, the unique sales proposition, as this slide is titled, is in exploring the world of Viking England, right? So you get details on hearths, you get details on their horses, their armor, their swords, how the nobility lived, how the peasants lived, etc. But notice that this is separable from the story. And the best example is humor. You can tell a story and separate it from its humor. So you can have the same story be funny or not funny. So the way to think about a bonus is it's an added layer on top of your story. And when you put these three things together, that is what is going to make your book an attractive purchase to either agents and publishers on the one hand, or to readers on the other. So what we like to say is your minimum complete story, that 90-second version told aloud, is about your story. I'm sorry, is your story. And then this is about your story. So we are separating those two things. And if you haven't worked out what your value triangle is, we'll help you, right? The best thing you can do is to talk to fellow authors, talk through your story, and then see how the value triangle emerges after that. And then a second point is, which I'm going to cover in more detail in a second, it's provisional, right? That means you try to think about what it is, understanding that you may have more and better thoughts in the future. So you're going to have to think carefully about it to start, but you're really not going to get a handle on your value triangle until you're about a third to halfway through your novel. And even then, it's subject to revision, right? I know someone in present company is revising their value triangle, and we're going to introduce that topic when we do her example. So let me start talking more formally about this tool. So what I want to start your thinking off is with what I'm going to call the chapter paradox. So you want your chapters to be satisfying. The way people read is they tend to read one chapter at a time. Now they may stop and pick up your novel again 2 or 3 weeks later. And who knows what went on in that intervening time. They may have gotten fired from work, their dog's sick. Whatever happens is going to interfere with their understanding. Alternatively, they may read one chapter, go right on to the next chapter. You don't know. You don't have any control over that. What you have to realize in this respect is that we are in a customer service industry, and you want to do your best to make that reading experience as enjoyable in whatever sense they like, scary, right, funny, whatever the reader's looking for in that genre, as easy as possible. And the best way to do that is to make sure each chapter is an independent unit and stands alone. On the other hand, you have to keep them attached to that novel. That means maintaining continuity, developing your character arcs, and building your underlying theme so it is delivered with a powerful punch at the end of your novel. So this tool is primarily about juggling these two competing demands, making your chapter satisfying and yet leaving the reader wanting more. The other thing I put here is story to word ratio. So the idea is you have a story in your head, and then you have to split that story up over 30 chapters. What that means is that every chapter has to have the right amount of story. Too much story and things are too dense, too crowded, and you lose focus. Too little story and it's boring because it's not progressing. There's not enough material for the reader to sink their teeth into. Well, let's take another look at this. If you resolving this paradox, then turning your work into effective chapter requires 3 basic things. The first is orientation, which means making sure the author and the reader are on the same page. Usually it happens at the beginning of the chapter. The second is trying to decide what the focus of that chapter is going to be. Remember, if we think about a chapter as a mini satisfying story, every story needs a singular peak. And I say memorable because that's about as much as you can expect the reader to grab after reading 3,000 or so words. They're going to learn maybe one big thing about your chapter, maybe some ancillary details that they're going to fill in or embellish about your characters and world. But that big thing, which you can think of as the focal point or the pivotal point, it's often called, of a chapter, is what this tool is designed to figure out. And if you're having trouble with that, the best shortcut you can use is try to think about what you would title a chapter. I don't know. I'll use Joe. Jesse's epiphany. So Jessie is one of her characters. She has an epiphany. That's a whole chapter. 3,000 words that orient the reader, set up the epiphany, have the epiphany, create the internality, and then have a resolution. Now, a lot of people are lazy, right? Chapter 1, what's the title? 1. Chapter 2, what's the title? 2. Chapter 30, what's the title? 30. Or people try to get cute, right? They've watched Friends or something, the one with the X. You can do that. But we recommend at least thinking about what the title should be and having that capture what the focus of that chapter is. And then the third part of it is continuity. So continuity is equivalent to orientation, except that comes at the end, right? Orientation is taking the previous chapter and getting the reader into this chapter smoothly. So mainly it's largely a matter of reestablishing that empathy with the main character, or whoever the point of view character is. And then continuity is how a chapter links up to what comes after it. And if you have orientation and continuity in place, the reader's never going to get lost. And if you do it well, it's going to keep building, right? Why does the event in chapter 7 lead to the event in chapter 8? You should be able to answer that so that the reader is able to answer that. If you can't answer that as an author, how is the reader supposed to get your story? That was a bit rhetorical. The answer is they can't. So I was going to talk about this as a little digression, but I think it's important to emphasize this point. The worst thing that can happen to you as an author is what we call DNF. Anyone know what that stands for? Yes. Did not finish. So let's think about what that means. Someone, you wrote your book, right? You revised it, you polished it, you published it, you marketed it, you did everything necessary, you got it into the reader's hands, and either they borrowed it or bought it, and now they're reading it. So the worst thing that can possibly happen is that they don't finish it. So if you think about some analogs, you can think about Netflix and Kindle Direct Publishing, right? What does Netflix do? Well, they track how many minutes someone spends watching a particular episode, and they track very closely whether someone watches episode 2 after watching episode 1, etc. And what they're looking for is did not finish, or more colloquially, the completion rate. You want someone who watched the first episode to watch all the episodes in a series. Otherwise, that series is a failure, right? It represents a loss of all the production costs and effort, as well as all the marketing costs and effort. Very, very bad. Kindle Publishing, or Kindle Unlimited especially, tracks every single page the reader reads. They turn the page, you get an extra couple cents, or even thousandths of a cent. They don't, that revenue is gone. Not only for the next page, but for every page, for every page that follows the point at which they stopped. Again, a waste of your efforts, your production efforts, a waste of your marketing efforts, the worst thing that can happen to you. You actually got the book into the reader's hands and they were reading it. And then there's fallout, right? I didn't finish this book. I got to page X and it was so confusing and boring, I gave up. Not the kind of review you want to see on Goodreads. All right. Guess where the number one point most people give up is? At a chapter break. Either they're too confused or they're not getting enough out of the book to move on. And so they just don't pick it up again. It may not even be a conscious decision, right? They may have read 3 chapters and got distracted, and then it comes time to start thinking about chapter 4, and then they're like, I'll just start a new book. That is DNF, and that is what we're trying to avoid. So, one of the primary purposes of this tool is to make sure DNF doesn't happen. Now, there are lower level things you can do to help with this problem. Largely a matter of maintaining consistency, et cetera, not boredom, having action, delivering your bonus. All of these things can be elevated by using this particular tool. So hopefully you're sold. Now we'll take a look at the tool itself. I'm calling this a spreadsheet. Why? I like spreadsheets. I was trained on them. I wasn't an accountant, but I was an academic. The main feature is you can look at things all at once and reorganize them very easily. You can sort, right? You can mark things, etc. You don't have to use a spreadsheet. If you hate computers, if you hate spreadsheets, you can use index cards. You can use paper. You can use Post-its. But the thing is, you need to be able to conceptualize your entire novel in one place. Again, you have your first chapter, you have your MCS, you have your value triangle. Now we're going the next step and creating the entire novel. So, how to do it. Again, I'm going to talk about this as a spreadsheet. If you're using index cards, it's equally important to follow this pattern. So, you have 3 columns. 1 column for each part of your value triangle. So the first column is generally plot. That is, oh, sorry. We have a question. Oh, good. Yeah, I totally agree. You know, some people don't, but what can I say? They're heretics. The first column isn't that different than what every other writing teacher recommends, that you sort of go through your plot chapter by chapter to make sure everything lines up. I would add that a lot of them don't emphasize this fact that you need a focal peak. But that's not all a novel needs to do. The thing I really want you to think about is empathy with your character. And what I would argue is that is separate than plot. So what does establishing empathy require? Again, I'm referencing our recently published guide, Publishable Characters. But empathy requires that the character have an identity that starts in chapter 1 and grows throughout the novel until the reader is perfectly familiar with that character. If you're doing your job right, they will know that character better than they know their best friend, better than they know their spouse, better than they know their animal. Why? It's because of that internality we talked about earlier. Novels give readers direct access to that person's thoughts. And that is the basis for empathy. And if you don't have that empathy, you're not only risking DNF, but you're risking all the other things, right? There's no impact. There's nothing. So establishing that empathy, growing that familiarity with character is so important that it gets its own column. And while you are building that character, you are also laying out their arc. I'm not going to talk about arcs too much in this workshop, but arcs have a beginning, right? The character's identity at the start of the story. Then you learn more and more about the character. Meanwhile, the character themselves is changing. And that change has to be planned, right? You want the character to move from a starting point in the novel to an ending identity in a novel in a carefully graduated set of stages. Otherwise, it's just not believable. It's not meaningful, right? Readers need to co-experience the character's development. And they only do that if you've constructed everything very carefully. So that second column has to do double duty. It talks about what the reader is learning about the character and becoming more familiar. And it also shows it evidences how the character is changing along with the events of the plot in column 1. And then the last column is bonus, right? So this is a question I love about bonus. I'm writing a book about dragons. How many dragons do I need in the book? What's the answer? At least 1 per chapter. So, any watch the first season of House of the Dragon on HBO, Game of Thrones? The biggest criticism were there were 8 episodes and only 2 dragon fights. That means only 1/4 of the show had a dragon in it. Now, I'm not saying that you have to have a big set piece action in every chapter with a dragon book, but there has to be something about dragons in every chapter. A mention, right? A backstory, an expanding of dragonology, something. And then a number of chapters have to give you a huge bonus, right? The big set piece dragon battle. If it's not there, readers are going to be wondering why they bought the book. Just like not having enough vitamins in your cereal. Humor, right? A funny book has to be funny in every chapter. You can have a dark chapter, right? Think about Catch-22, but you still have to be funny in every chapter. If you can't pull that off, don't try to write a funny novel. If you can pull it off, make sure there's funny in every chapter. That doesn't mean you have to write funny all the time. What it means is you have to use this tool, the continuity and value delivery sheet, to space out your funny to make sure you're delivering a steady stream of it. Does that make sense so far? All right. Once you have your columns set up, then you're going to move to your rows. And the rule here is simple. 1 row for each chapter. The unit of our novel delivery is in chapters because that is how much a reader is reading at a time. So the goal of this sheet is to make sure every chapter fulfills its promise. So the first chapter lays out a promise. This is a horror story. It is super scary, right? And the main character is what? Let's just say she's an addicted, etc. Previewing one of the stories you're about to hear. The reader expects that to continue, that story to continue throughout the entire novel. And that expectation takes the form of delivering this value chapter by chapter. And we've experienced this, right? Oh, this was a really funny book in the first third of it, and then the author sort of stopped being funny. Or this chapter wasn't scary at all. I mean, it wasn't even related to scary. It was some other genre. I guess the worst example is The Mandalorian on the Star Wars TV series. Anyone familiar with that? All right, I'm a nerd, I'll admit it. Book of Boba Fett, right? It's supposed to be about this badass bounty hunter. Okay, I'll grant them that. But then I think it was an 8-episode series. Episodes 6 and 7 were about an entirely different character, the Mandalorian themselves. So I don't know why they did this. Andor is the contrast, a perfect show. Every episode delivered value on every level. The Mandalorian, they weren't even filler episodes. They were episodes from an entirely different story. Authors can't do that and expect their readers to be satisfied. Period. All right. So the trick to pulling this off is point 3. So we have our 3 columns. We have our 30 rows. Do you guys know what a cell is? A cell is the little box on the spreadsheet. So if you're doing index cards, you divide them into 3 columns, and then each column is a cell, and you have 30 index cards. And if you're using Post-its, Lord help you. But, right, that cell has to be, those are my hearts. I will love the cell if it is a single declarative sentence, right? The tendency we see among most authors we work with at Bardsy is for them to shove everything in that chapter into that cell. So the worst thing you can do is what? A copy and paste of all the 3,000 chapter words spread across the 3 cells. No effort, right? The effort here is in thinking through what this chapter is about and reducing it to a single sentence for the plot, a single sentence for the character development and arc, and then a single sentence for the bonus. And declarative, right? You want them to be active sentences, sentences that show a character's agency, sentences that show an action that's taking place in the plot, sentences that show a benefit from whatever the bonus is. All of this work, right, focusing in on what's essential, is going to help you in the long run because it's going to make thinking about the chapter that much easier. And again, this is provisional, right? The sentence doesn't have to be perfect. Write whatever sentence comes to mind and then refine it later. You'll see an example in just a second. All right, so I emailed you the samples. I didn't know how to do this best, but they were PDFs. The advantage of a PDF, first of all, I didn't use spreadsheets because I didn't know if everyone had access to Excel or whatever spreadsheet you're using. PDFs have the virtue of being able to zoom in and zoom out. So when it comes time for the demo, I'd like you to pull it up on your own computer so you can be able to zoom in and zoom out as your eyesight permits. I have horrible eyesight, so this is way too small for me, and I understand that. But you can see the overall shape, right? The three, yeah, let me try to zoom in. I don't even know how to zoom in. I don't think it's going to work. Yeah, no, just change the font size. But you can see the general shape, right? On the left, we have the chapters. On the top, we have the 3 columns. So let's talk a little bit about creating your sheet. Again, I want to repeat this. So important. It's provisional, right? A lot of authors stumble on the fact that they think that everything they do has to be perfect. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Right? The only time you need perfection is when you hit the send button on the email you send to your agent or publisher, or when you hit the publish button on Kindle, etc. Right? It's impossible, right? We're all perfectionists, otherwise we wouldn't be here. But cut yourself some slack. Try not to be a perfectionist. Just put down whatever comes to mind. 9 times out of 10, it's going to be the right answer because you know your story, especially if you've been doing your MCS regularly. And you can change it, right? The thing I hate most about, do your novel in 2 weeks or whatever, a month to a novel, are these templating systems, right? Fill in these boxes and you'll turn out a great novel. It just doesn't work. Why? Because you're constantly thinking about your story, refining it, developing it, making it tighter, better, more coherent. And on top of that, inspiration is going to strike. You're sitting in the shower, you're driving a car, you have an idea. What if this character did this? Or you solve a problem, right? This chapter is kind of boring. I need to invent something. We do that in our writing groups all the time. People are on board. And so the author says, oh, frick, I better do something. And then that idea comes to them. You want to incorporate that inspiration into your novel. And the way to do that is to recognize that what you're using these tools for is provisional, right? So I can go back and change the sentence describing chapter 7. And I can move stuff around. I can move chapter 9 to chapter 3. Copy and paste is a wonderful thing. You don't have to throw it away. You move it. And you update your sheet so that it reflects the new and improved version. And there's another side of perfectionism, which is people, oh, I can't do this, right? I don't know my story, right? I'll do it next week. It's okay for this to be partial, right? So start with your first chapter. I'm using the language retrospective versus prospective. You've got your first chapter done. Write the 3 sentences about that. Bang, your first row is done. You should have your second chapter pretty well thought through. Write the 3 sentences about that, and so on. If you finished a third of your first draft, you've got 10 chapters, you should be able to fill in all those rows. if you finished a first draft of your entire novel, hint, hint, you should be able to fill in every single row. Now, it may not be perfect, right? Again, it's provisional. It can be partial, but you're still filling in the rows so you can get more concrete about your thinking and how you're revising your novel. And then there's a prospective part, right? Okay, I've done row 1 through 7. What am I going to do for row 8? Well, read through row 1 through 7. You should have a pretty good idea, if your story's well enough developed, as to what that row 8 is going to be, as to how you're going to write chapter 8. Same thing for chapter 9. If you do your MCS properly, you should have a good idea of where the novel's going to peak and where the novel's going to end, which means you can fill in row 30 and whatever your peak is, probably row 24, right? That's okay. The first part's going to be well done. The middle part's going to be okay. Hopefully you can establish your peak and at least sketch it out in 3 sentences. And then ideally you'll be able to capture your resolution. If you can't, that's fine too. Do the part you have, use the other tools to help your brain fill this in, and then complete the rest of the rows as they gel, right? And then when the entire tool is in place, let me just show you this example. Let's go, this should have come earlier. This is how we think about essence, right? The top is a good sentence, right? It describes the plot in chapter 1. The bottom is a better sentence because it focuses more tightly on what's essential in fewer words. So I'll read these to you. At the end of her bartending shift, Jessie covers for Scott Bauer when he shows up with plans to place a hex on the club shortly before an armed robbery breaks out and spirals into a shooting. So the author here has done this great first effort. I'm not dissing it at all, but we want to take the next step and boil it down, right? We boil it down for the reasons I listed. So our mind concentrates on what we're trying to convey to the reader. What are we trying to convey? Well, something about the character, right? In fact, the first introductory phrase may go in the character column. Anxiously awaiting her dealer, right? Jessie is an addict who's going through withdrawal. Now that I think about it, maybe it should go in the second column because it is about character. The plot point here is Jessie chooses not to stop Scott Bauer. That's the agency. And what happens? The consequence is he opens a gate to hell, right? Not a good thing. And then coincidentally, somewhat coincidentally, you'll learn later on, a robbery is happening simultaneously. Those 3/4 things are the first chapter. And notice some of the things from the first sentence were dropped. It spirals into a shooting. Important, but probably not important enough to reach the level of essential, right? The robbery is happening. The consequences are a shooting. That's sort of a judgment call. The dealer part, really important. The fact that she chooses as opposed to covering is just a little bit stronger language. And then you see the Scott Bauer action changes from placing a hex on the club to opening a gate to hell, right? A much more powerful and significant event that the first chapter's action is going to portray. So this is an exercise you're going to need to do over and over again on every cell until they are perfectly established to maximize the reader's excitement, their empathy with your character, etc. Again, don't be a perfectionist, right? But at least try to get it right in a small space. All right, let's talk a little bit about using it. As you complete this sheet, the most important usage is to write each chapter. right? The sheet should have all the preceding chapters fairly well done. And as you write or revise the next chapter, you're going to think carefully about these 3 sentences and make sure you hit that target. And more broadly, if you discover you're having troubles, right? Not enough story in chapter 3, too many foci in chapter 7, right? Or not, competing foci. If you have a dual focus in a given chapter, that's very, very bad. So it means you have to split up that chapter. If you don't have a sufficiently weighty focus in a given chapter, it means you have to put one in there, right? So you can use this sheet to manipulate how much story is going into each chapter. And then finally, you want to upgrade and assess your sheet, right? You have the sheet in front of you. Just like you practice your MCS, once this sheet is established, you want to periodically talk through and update this sheet. It's developing your story. It's helping you write the chapters. It's helping you set the boundaries on chapters. And if you keep doing this successfully, what you're going to see is that there's going to be an alignment. We talked about the levels of story from overall narrative MCS at the top to individual words and sentences at the bottom. In a coherent novel, the one you want to send to agents, to publish, etc., all of those things have to be aligned for it to be coherent. The story has to be told successfully at every level. All right, let's take a few steps.
Bardsy delivers the tools, guidance, and support you need to produce compelling novels. Our well-researched and thoroughly tested approach includes our minimum complete story, a 90-second exercise that keeps your writing on track while fueling creativity. Bardsy Publishability Index, a 23-dimension checklist that offers attainable goals and provides actionable feedback. And our brand new comprehensive character developer that helps you construct unforgettable characters. Come see for yourself at Bardsy.com today. Try our workshop or enter our first chapter contest. Then, when you're ready, Elite Membership delivers writing groups, personal coaching, and a curated community. With Bardsy, your work will captivate everyone, from agents to publishers, and, most importantly, your readers.